The misunderstanding. John Smith stared at the alien woman standing in his living room. Her skin had a slight blue tint, and her silver hair seemed to float as if she was underwater. She wore what looked like a fancy spacesuit, complete with glowing patterns that pulsed with a soft light. "I am Zora, your contracted servant for the next Earth year," she said, bowing slightly. Her English was perfect, but had a musical quality to it. "I have arrived as specified in Section 47B of your employment agreement." John's head hurt. Just yesterday, he had signed a contract with what he thought was a normal office job at Smith & Galaxy Industries. He had been so happy to find work after 3 months of searching that he hadn't read all the small print. That was clearly a mistake. "There must be some error," John said, running his hands through his messy brown hair. "I signed up to be an office worker, not to have an alien servant." Zora pulled out a thin tablet made of what looked like glass. It floated in the air between them, displaying the contract in glowing text. "See here," she said, pointing to a tiny paragraph at the bottom. "By signing this document, you agree to provide housing and protection to one galactic service provider for a duration of 1 Earth year." John tried to grab the floating contract, but his hand passed right through it. Zara made a small clicking sound that might have been a laugh. "The document is a hologram," she explained, "and I'm afraid the contract cannot be canceled. It's binding under both Earth and galactic law." John collapsed onto his worn-out couch. "This can't be happening. I need to contact the company." "I can help with that," Zara said brightly. She waved her hand, and a strange device appeared out of thin air. It looked like a phone made of crystal and starlight. Before John could stop her, Zara pressed several buttons. A beam of blue light shot out, burning a small hole in John's ceiling. "Oops," Zara said, looking embarrassed. "Earth communication systems are so primitive. Let me try again." "No." John jumped up and grabbed the device. "No more alien technology. I'll just go to their office." But when John arrived at the building where he had signed the contract, he found only an empty lot. The entire 10-story office building had vanished as if it had never existed. Back at his apartment, things were getting worse. Zara had decided to help by cleaning. She had released what looked like tiny floating robots that were now chasing his cat around the living room. "The cleaning nanites are harmless," Zara assured him as his cat, Mr. Whiskers, yowled and hid under the couch. "They just want to remove the excess fur." "Call them off," John shouted. "No more alien stuff." Zara looked hurt but waved her hand. The tiny robots disappeared with small popping sounds. "I am only trying to fulfill my contract," she said quietly. "On my in my previous position, I was considered very helpful." John felt a bit guilty seeing her sad face. "Look, I appreciate that you want to help, but things work differently here on Earth. We can't have floating robots or laser phones. People will notice." As if to prove his point, someone knocked on his door. John looked through the peephole and felt his heart skip a beat. 2 men in black suits stood outside, wearing dark sunglasses despite it being evening. "Mr. Smith," one called out, "we're from the government. We'd like to ask you about some unusual energy signatures we detected in this area." John turned to Zara in panic. "Hide," he whispered. But Zara was already gone. In her place was a note floating in midair, written in glowing letters. "Don't worry. I've made myself invisible, but you should know, they're not really government agents. Their suits are made of material not found on Earth. We might have a problem." John took a deep breath and opened the door, trying to act normal. As he faced the mysterious men in black, one thought kept running through his mind. What else had been hidden in that contract's fine print? And somewhere in the apartment, invisible to all, Zara watched with growing concern. She hadn't told John the whole truth about who she was or why she really needed this contract. But with these men showing up, she might have to reveal everything sooner than she had planned. Unwanted attention. The fake government agents turned out to be just the beginning of John's problems. after he managed to convince them that the energy readings were just a faulty microwave. Thanks to Zara's quick thinking and invisible tech manipulation, life got even more complicated. "Your mother called," Zara announced one morning, floating cross-legged 3 feet above John's kitchen counter. "She's coming to visit this weekend." John spilled his coffee. "You talked to my mother? How did you even answer my phone?" "Oh, I didn't need to," Zora said, her silver hair swirling in an invisible breeze. "Your communication device was in your bedroom. I simply connected to it through my neural interface." She smiled proudly. "I told her I was your girlfriend." John nearly choked. "You what?" "It seemed the most logical cover story," Zora explained, finally floating down to stand on the floor. "She was asking why a woman's voice could be heard in your apartment by the neighbors. I couldn't tell her I was your alien servant, could I?" Before John could respond, a soft beeping sound filled the apartment. Zara's expression changed from cheerful to serious in an instant. She waved her hand, and a holographic display appeared, showing what looked like a 3D map of the building. "We have a problem," she said. "Someone has placed quantum tracking devices throughout your apartment complex. They're designed to detect non-Earth technology." She pointed to several glowing dots on the map. "There are 7. No, 8 of them." "More aliens?" John asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. "Worse," Zora said. "These are Galactic Security Bureau devices. The GSB monitors unauthorized alien activity on developing planets. If they find me here..." She didn't finish the sentence. John was about to ask what they should do when his doorbell rang. Through the peephole, he saw his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, holding a plate of cookies. "Quick," he whispered to Zara. "Act normal." Zara snapped her fingers, and her appearance instantly changed. The silver hair turned black, the blue tint of her skin faded to a natural human tone, and her glowing suit transformed into jeans and a sweater. The only problem was, she was still floating a few inches off the ground. "Zara," feet on the floor. She dropped just as John opened the door. Mrs. Chen smiled warmly, but her eyes were sharp and observant. "I brought cookies for you and your new friend," she said, peering past John. "Such a lovely girl. Though I could have sworn I saw her hair glowing silver through the window yesterday. Must have been the light reflecting off her hair product," John said quickly. "Thank you for the cookies, Mrs. Chen." After she left, Zora's disguise flickered off. "That woman isn't what she seems," she said thoughtfully. "Her body temperature readings are inconsistent with human norms, and I detected a small energy signature." "Are you saying Mrs. Chen is an alien too?" "No, but she might be working for someone who monitors aliens. This building..." Zara walked to the window, her suit's patterns pulsing faster. "I don't think it's a coincidence that the GSB placed trackers here, or that those agents visited, or that your new job contract led you to this specific apartment." A loud crash from the hallway interrupted her. John's cat, Mr. Whiskers, came tearing into the apartment through his pet door, fur standing on end. The cat ran straight to Zara and started mewing urgently. "Oh my," Zara said, her eyes widening. "Your pet appears to have some interesting genetic modifications. He's trying to warn us." "Warn us about what?" "He's just a regular cat I adopted from the shelter." Zara knelt beside Mr. Whiskers, who was now glowing faintly blue. "No, John. Your cat was engineered by the Galactic Science Division. He's a biological security system, designed to detect and track certain alien species." She looked up at John, her expression worried. "Species like, well, like my people." Before John could process this revelation, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his mother. "Surprise. We're in the neighborhood and thought we'd drop by early. Be there in 5 minutes. Can't wait to meet this girlfriend of yours." John looked at his alien companion, his genetically engineered cat, and the 8 hidden tracking devices in his apartment. "Zara," he said weakly, "I think we need a better plan than act normal." Zara nodded, her hair beginning to float again as she accessed her powers. Indeed. But first, she reached down and picked up Mr. Whiskers, who was now purring and glowing even brighter. I believe your cat, and I need to have a serious conversation about who he's been reporting to. The doorbell rang again. Through the peephole, John could see his parents. Behind them, Mrs. Chen was accidentally dropping her mail, taking her time to pick it up while watching his door. And at the end of the hallway, the elevator opened to reveal two more men in black suits. It was going to be an interesting afternoon. The truth emerges. The meeting with John's parents had gone surprisingly well, mostly because Zara had used some alien tech to make them fall asleep on the couch before they could ask too many questions. Now they were peacefully napping, thinking they had dozed off during a nice chat over tea. "We need to talk," Zara said, her voice more serious than John had ever heard it. She was pacing the ceiling, literally walking upside down above his head. Those men in the hallway weren't just GSB agents. They're from the Crimson Shadow. And that is... John watched as Mr. Whiskers, still glowing faintly blue, tracked Zora's movement with his eyes. The most dangerous criminal organization in the galaxy. Zara dropped from the ceiling, landing gracefully beside John. Her usual playful demeanor was gone. "They're the reason I'm really here, John. The employment contract. It wasn't an accident." She waved her hand, and her appearance shimmed like a disrupted reflection. The simple alien servant's outfit disappeared. In its place was an elaborate royal gown that seemed to be made of living starlight, with patterns that moved like constellations across the fabric. A delicate crown of what looked like crystallized light appeared above her head. "My real name is Princess Zerafina Celestis of the Arcturus Empire," she said quietly. "And I chose you to help me hide." John sat down hard on the floor. Mr. Whiskers immediately jumped into his lap, purring what felt like an apology. "Your cat was engineered by my family science division. Zara, or Princess Zerafina, continued. He was supposed to protect me, but something went wrong with the transport coordinates. He ended up in an Earth animal shelter instead of with me." She smiled. "But he still found his way to you, just like I did." "Why me?" John managed to ask. "Because you're invisible," she said. "Not literally, of course, but in all the important ways. Your job, your apartment, your life, they're all so perfectly ordinary that no one would think to look for an alien princess here. The contract company was real, but I adjusted their paperwork a bit." A holographic screen appeared in the air, showing news headlines from across the galaxy. John couldn't read the alien text, but the images were clear enough. War, destruction, political intrigue. 6 months ago, the Crimson Shadow infiltrated my family's palace, Zara explained. They planted evidence suggesting I had committed treason, planning to sell military secrets to our enemies. I was facing execution. Her voice trembled slightly. My own father, the Emperor, couldn't officially help me, but he gave me a chance to escape. Suddenly, Mr. Whiskers leaped up, his glow turning red. Zara spun around, her gown swirling like a nebula. "They're here," she whispered. The apartment walls seemed to ripple, and 4 figures stepped through them, as if they were made of water. They wore armor that seemed to absorb light, making it hard to look at them directly. Their helmets had no visors, just smooth black surfaces that reflected John's terrified face back at him. "Princess Zerafina," one of them said, their voice sounding like static and thunder. "Your game of hide-and-seek is over." Zara raised her hands, and energy crackled between her fingers. "John, take Mr. Whiskers and run. The cat knows where to go." "I'm not leaving you," John protested, even as Mr. Whiskers tugged at his pant leg with glowing teeth. "How touching," another shadow warrior said mockingly. "The princess has found herself a pet human. Should we tell him what really happened at the palace? About the rebellion you tried to start? About the thousands who died?" "That's not what happened," Zara shouted, her hair now floating like silver flames. "You staged that rebellion. You killed those people." The shadow warriors began to spread out, their armor rippling like oil on water. One of them glanced at John's sleeping parents on the couch. "Such fragile creatures, humans," the warrior said. "It would be a shame if something were to happen to them." That's when Mr. Whiskers decided to show his true nature. The small house cat suddenly grew to the size of a tiger, his blue glow becoming blinding. Mechanical components emerged from his fur, forming armor plates and what looked suspiciously like weapon systems. "I forgot to mention," Zara said with a slight smile, "the genetic modifications weren't just for detecting aliens." The apartment erupted into chaos. Zara threw up an energy shield just as the Shadow Warriors opened fire with weapons that shot beams of darkness. Mr. Whiskers launched himself at one of the intruders, his claws leaving glowing scratches in their light-absorbing armor. John dove behind his couch, his mind racing. His apartment was being destroyed by a battle between an alien princess, her combat-enhanced cat, and 4 Shadow Warriors. And his parents were still sleeping peacefully through it all. Thank goodness for alien sedative tea. But as he watched Zora fighting, her royal gown flowing like liquid starlight, her powers lighting up the room with impossible colors, he realized something important. Whether she was a princess or a servant, whether she was innocent or guilty, she was his friend. And he wasn't going to let her face this alone. He grabbed the nearest object, which happened to be his mother's favorite casserole dish that she brought over, and threw it at the nearest Shadow Warrior's head. To everyone's surprise, it actually worked. The dish passed right through the warrior's light-bending camouflage and connected with their very solid helmet. "Nice throw," Zora called out, blasting another warrior with what looked like miniature stars. "But next time, maybe don't use your mother's antique cookware." The fight was far from over, but as John watched his cat-turned battle tank wrestling with a Shadow Warrior while Zara dueled with 2 more, he had a feeling his life would never be perfectly ordinary again. And oddly enough, he was starting to be okay with that. On the run. The battle in John's apartment ended with a blinding flash of light that turned his living room into something that looked like modern art. 2 Shadow Warriors were trapped in temporal stasis, frozen mid-attack like strange statues. The other 2 had escaped through the walls. But not before Mr. Whiskers, in his battle tank form, had ripped pieces of their light-absorbing armor off. "We can't stay here," Zara said, her royal gown flickering back to her simpler servant's outfit. "The stasis field won't hold them for long." She looked sadly at John's sleeping parents on the couch. "I'm sorry about your home." John looked around at his destroyed apartment. The walls had scorch marks from energy weapons, there was a cat-sized hole in his kitchen counter, and reality itself seemed to be bent in several corners where the Shadow Warriors had phased through. "I always wanted to redecorate anyway," he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. "What's the plan?" That's when Mrs. Chen burst through the door, holding what looked like an ancient Chinese fan made of glowing metal. "The plan," she said, her gentle elderly neighbor act completely gone, "is that you 3 come with me if you want to live." She snapped the fan open, and holographic symbols filled the air. "I'm not just your neighbor. I'm the local coordinator for the Earth branch of the Galactic Refugee Protection Program." Mr. Whiskers, still in his combat form, made a happy chirping sound and rubbed against Mrs. Chen's legs like a house-sized mechanical cat. Yes, good to see you too, Agent Whiskers," she said, scratching behind his armored ears. "Your original mission was to make contact with me, but getting adopted by John here actually worked out better." "Wait," John said, his head spinning. "My cat is a secret agent. A royal guard, a genetic experiment, and a secret agent," Zara corrected. "The Arcturus Empire likes its operatives to be multifunctional." Mrs. Chen's fan suddenly beeped urgently. "More Crimson Shadow forces are coming. We need to move. Now." She pressed a pattern on her fan, and a section of John's floor turned transparent, revealing a glowing tunnel beneath. "The Earth is riddled with ancient alien transport networks. This one will take us to safety." As they hurried into the tunnel, after Zara used her powers to make John's parents float behind them like sleeping balloons, John had to ask, "How many aliens are actually on Earth?" "More than you'd think," Mrs. Chen said, leading them down the luminescent passage. "That barista at your local coffee shop who always spells your name wrong. Andromeda refugee. The guy who runs the food truck outside your office. Retired galactic peacekeeper. Your dentist. Actually human, but his assistant is from the Pleiades cluster. Is that why she has such cold hands?" John wondered aloud. Their conversation was interrupted by a rumbling sound from behind them. The Shadow Warriors had broken free of the stasis field and were pursuing them through the tunnel, their armor leaving trails of darkness in the glowing walls. "Mr. Whiskers," Zara commanded. "Rear guard duty." The combat cat took up a defensive position, his mechanical components reconfiguring into what looked like a heavy weapons platform. The tunnel lit up with laser fire and antimatter pulses. "This way," Mrs. Chen called, leading them through a series of dizzying turns. The tunnel network was like a glowing maze, with passages branching off in impossible directions. Some tunnels went straight up, others seemed to loop in Mobius strips, and a few appeared to open into other dimensions entirely. The network was built by the precursors, Zara explained as they ran. The same ancient race that first discovered Earth and classified it as a protected developing world. That's why we have to be so careful about using alien technology openly here. Unlike some princesses who float around apartments and walk on ceilings, Mrs. Chen said dryly. They emerged from the tunnels into what looked like an abandoned subway station, except everything was covered in the same bioluminescent material as the tunnels. Dozens of aliens of various species were gathered there, many disguised as humans, but now showing their true forms. "Welcome to Sanctuary Station," Mrs. Chen announced, one of Earth's many hidden refugee centers for galactic citizens in need of protection. A tall figure stepped forward from the crowd. John recognized him as Tom from the hot dog stand near his office, except now he was 7 feet tall, had 4 arms, and his skin was a deep purple color. "Princess," Tom said, bowing deeply. "We received word from your father. The evidence against you was finally traced to its source." He produced a holographic document. "The Crimson Shadow didn't act alone. They had help from inside your father's court." Zara's face went pale. "No, it can't be." Before she could finish, the station's alarms began blaring. On the security screens, they could see more Shadow Warriors emerging from multiple tunnels. But these weren't just regular troops. Leading them was a figure in ornate black armor with red energy crackling around them like lightning. "General Vex," Zara whispered, "my father's most trusted military advisor. The one who taught me how to use my powers." Her voice hardened. "And apparently, the one who betrayed me." The security screens showed the Shadow Warriors setting up what looked like reality warping devices around the station. "They're trying to collapse the dimensional barriers around the sanctuary," Mrs. Chen said, her fan displaying rapid calculations. "If they succeed, this whole place will be exposed to normal space-time. Every alien refugee on Earth will be revealed." John looked around at the scared faces of the refugees, then at his still sleeping parents, now gently propped against a wall, then at Zara. Her royal gown had reappeared, and she stood tall despite her obvious shock at the betrayal. "So," he said, picking up what looked like an alien weapon from a nearby rack, "anyone want to teach me how to use this thing?" Mr. Whiskers, who had caught up with them, made an approving sound and began projecting a holographic user manual from his eyes. "I always knew there was a reason I chose your contract," Zara said with a small smile. "You may be ordinary, John Smith, but you have an extraordinary heart." "Less talking, more preparing for battle," Mrs. Chen interrupted, her fan transforming into what looked suspiciously like an energy sword. "They'll breach the outer defenses in 3 minutes." As the refugees began arming themselves and taking up defensive positions, John had a sudden thought. "Hey, what exactly are we going to tell my parents when they wake up?" One crisis at a time, Zura said, her hands beginning to glow with power. First, we save Earth from being exposed to the galaxy. Then we deal with the traitorous general. And then, she gave him a worried look. Then we try to explain to your mother why her casserole dish was sacrificed in battle. The first explosions rocked the station, and the final battle for Sanctuary Station began. The choice. The battle for Sanctuary Station had been raging for hours. John had never imagined he would be fighting alongside an alien princess, his combat-enhanced cat, and his elderly neighbor who turned out to be a legendary alien refugee protector. Yet here he was, ducking behind a crystalline barrier as shadow warriors tried to break through their defenses. Their reality warpers are at 60%. Mrs. Chen called out, her fan displaying complex readings. Once they hit 100, the dimensional barriers will collapse. Zara deflected another blast of dark energy with her powers. Her royal gown was torn and scorched, but she fought on. We need to reach those devices and shut them down. That's when General Vex's voice boomed through the station, seemingly coming from everywhere at once. Princess Zerafina. The voice held a mocking tone. Why do you continue this pointless resistance? Your father's empire is corrupt. The galaxy needs change. Join us, and you can help shape that change. By exposing innocent refugees, Zara shouted back. By betraying everything we stood for. Stood for? Vex laughed. You mean the lies they fed you since childhood. Let me show you the truth. Suddenly, holographic images filled the air around them. They showed scenes from across the galaxy, planets under the Empire's control, suffering under harsh conditions, secret military operations, dark deals with criminal organizations. Your father's perfect empire isn't so perfect after all, Vex's voice continued. The Crimson Shadow didn't corrupt the system. We merely exposed its corruption. Those refugees you're protecting, many are fleeing from your father's own policies. John saw doubt flicker across Zora's face. Some of the refugees in the station were looking at her with uncertain expressions. That's when Mr. Whiskers, still in his battle form, projected his own holographic display. It showed different scenes. Empire ships protecting civilian transports, medical aid being delivered to disaster zones, Zara herself working in refugee camps as a child. The Empire isn't perfect, Mrs. Chen said, stepping forward. But it's not the evil Vex claims it is. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. A massive explosion rocked the station. Through the smoke, General Vex himself appeared. His armor was like a piece of midnight come to life, with red energy crackling around him like blood-colored lightning. His helmet retracted, revealing a face that might once have been handsome, but was now crossed with cybernetic implants that glowed with the same red energy. Enough games, he said. Princess, I'm offering you one chance. Join us willingly, and we'll spare this sanctuary and everyone in it. Refuse. He gestured and screens showed dozens more shadow warriors surrounding the station. Well, you can guess the alternative. Don't listen to him, John started to say, but suddenly found himself frozen in place. Vex had trapped him, Mrs. Chen, and even Mr. Whiskers in stasis fields. No interference, Vex said. This is her choice alone. Zora looked around at the frozen refugees, her friends, and then at the images still floating in the air, both the corruption and the good her family had done. You want me to make a choice, she said quietly. Fine. Here's my choice. She raised her hands, and her royal gown began to glow brighter than ever. But instead of attacking Vex, she did something unexpected. She reached out and touched the nearest reality warper device. Princess, no. Mrs. Chen managed to shout through the stasis field. If you overload that device, it could tear a hole in space-time. Exactly, Zora said. Energy began flowing from her into the device. General, you taught me everything I know about using my powers. Almost everything. The device began to hum dangerously. Vex's confident expression faltered. What are you doing? He demanded. My mother's people, Before they joined the Empire, were known as the Star Shapers, Zora continued. Her voice had taken on an ethereal quality, and her eyes were glowing like twin suns. They could manipulate the fabric of reality itself, a power that was deemed too dangerous to use, a power I inherited but was forbidden to access. The other reality warpers began to resonate with the one she was touching. The air itself seemed to be vibrating. "Stop this." Vex raised his weapons. "You'll destroy us all." "No," Zora said calmly. "I'm going to show everyone the real truth." Reality shifted. The station, the refugees, the shadow warriors, everything seemed to exist in multiple places at once. John found himself experiencing multiple timelines simultaneously. He saw Vex's betrayal from every angle, saw the Empire's sins and its virtues, saw the complex web of causes and effects that had led to this moment. And he wasn't alone. Everyone in the station, refugees, shadow warriors, and General Vex himself, was experiencing the same thing. The true history of events, untainted by perspective or propaganda. When reality stabilized, Vex fell to his knees. Some of his shadow warriors were removing their helmets, looking dazed. The refugees were picking themselves up, their expressions a mix of understanding and uncertainty. "That's my choice," Zora said, swaying slightly. John, freed from the stasis field, rushed to support her before she could fall. Not to pick a side, but to show that there are always more than two sides to any story. "The Star Shaper power," Vex whispered. "All these years, we thought it was just a legend, a weapon to be controlled. But it was never about control, was it? It was about understanding." Mrs. Chen's fan was going crazy with readings. "Princess, what you just did, you didn't just show us the truth. You've literally quantum entangled everyone in this station. We're all connected now on a fundamental level." "Which means," Zora said, managing a small smile, "that if the Crimson Shadow exposes this sanctuary, they'll be exposing themselves too. Their own agents, their own secrets." Vex looked at his hands, where the red energy was fading. "The corruption in the Empire is real," he said slowly. "But our response, maybe we became what we were fighting against." "Then help us fix it," Zora said, "not through violence or exposure, but through understanding. Real change." That's when John's mother chose the perfect moment to wake up from her alien-induced nap. "John, dear," she called out, looking around the impossible station filled with aliens, battle damage, and floating holograms. "Why is your cat the size of a car? And is that my casserole dish embedded in that wall?" John looked at Zora, who was trying not to laugh despite her exhaustion. "Remember when you said we'd deal with explaining things to my parents later? I think later just became now." As Mrs. Chen began diplomatically explaining things to John's bewildered parents, as Mr. Whiskers helped disarm the remaining reality warpers, as shell-shocked shadow warriors began talking with equally shell-shocked refugees, John had a feeling that this wasn't so much an ending as a new beginning. And judging by the way Zora was holding his hand, he wasn't the only one thinking about new beginnings. The trap, the quantum entanglement of everyone at Sanctuary Station, had changed things, but not as much as they'd hoped. While General Vex and many of his warriors had laid down their arms after experiencing the shared truth, a larger problem emerged. The Crimson Shadow's leadership was not happy about losing their top general to what they called Princess Magic. "They're coming," Mrs. Chen announced one morning, her fan displaying multiple alert signals. "Not just a strike team this time. They're bringing their entire Earth division." John looked up from where he was trying to explain to his parents why their family cat was currently teaching a group of alien refugees advanced combat tactics. It had been a weird week. "I thought the quantum entanglement would stop them," he said. "You know, mutual assured exposure. They found a workaround," Zora said grimly. She was wearing her royal gown again, but now it shifted between stars and shadows, showing her new understanding of the balance between light and dark. "They're sending operatives who aren't connected to their main organization. Mercenaries. Expendables." Cannon fodder, General Vex added. He had removed most of his cybernetic enhancements, though his eyes still glowed faintly red. It's what I would have done in my darker days. That's when John's mother, who had been surprisingly calm about everything, after her initial fainting spell, spoke up. You know, she said, casually stirring her tea, in my bridge club, we have a saying. If you can't beat them fairly, change the game entirely. Everyone stared at her. Mom, John said slowly, are you suggesting we set a trap? Well, dear, I didn't spend 40 years as an engineer designing secure systems just to sit here while alien criminals threaten my son's girlfriend. She pulled out a tablet and started sketching. Now, about these dimensional barriers. What followed was one of the strangest planning sessions in Earth's history. John's mother, it turned out, had some fascinating ideas about applying Earth engineering principles to alien technology. Mrs. Chen's experience with the refugee network provided intelligence. General Vex knew the enemy's tactics. And Mr. Whiskers, well, he was just happy to have his family finally working together. The plan they came up with was either brilliant or insane. Possibly both. Let me get this straight, John said, looking at the holographic blueprint floating above his mother's tablet. We're going to let them think they've won. Exactly, Zara said, her eyes sparkling with the same light he'd seen when she revealed her Star-Shaper powers. They want to expose the sanctuary. We'll help them do it. The next few days were a blur of preparation. The refugees were evacuated through the ancient tunnel network, but not before each of them left something behind. A piece of their energy signature, carefully preserved by Zora's powers. To anyone scanning the station, it would appear still full of aliens. John's father, who had been quietly observing everything, turned out to be surprisingly good at setting up holographic projectors. Just like Christmas lights, he said cheerfully, as he helped create the illusion of a fully functioning sanctuary. The trap was set. Now they just had to wait for someone to spring it. They didn't have to wait long. The attack came at midnight. Hundreds of mercenaries, armed with everything from primitive Earth weapons to advanced alien tech, swarmed the sanctuary's entrance points. Their leader, a towering figure in chrome armor, strode in confidently. Princess Zarafina, the Chrome commander called out, "Surrender now, and we'll make your execution quick." Zara stepped forward, appearing defeated. "You've won," she said quietly. "But before you take me, let me show you what you've captured." She raised her hands, and the station's lights began to flicker. The dimensional barriers seemed to waver. "Yes," the commander laughed. "The great sanctuary of Earth, finally exposed." That's when everything went wrong for the attackers. The dimensional barriers didn't just waver, they inverted. The station turned itself inside out, transforming into a maze of impossible geometry. The mercenaries found themselves separated, confused, walking on walls and ceilings that kept shifting. "Mum's idea," John explained to a particularly confused group of attackers as they floated past him. She called it a non-Euclidean defense system. Pretty cool, right? Mr. Whiskers, who had split himself into multiple smaller combat cats, another new trick, was herding the scattered mercenaries into containment areas. Mrs. Chen's fan had transformed into a control center, coordinating the entire operation. But the Chrome commander wasn't finished. He pulled out a device that made everyone's blood run cold, a dimensional nullifier, capable of forcing reality back to normal. "Enough games," he roared, activating the device. That's when General Vex made his move. While everyone had been focused on Zara, he had positioned himself near the commander. Now, he revealed why he'd kept just a few of his cybernetic enhancements. "The thing about betrayal," Vex said, his remaining implants glowing, "is that you learn to spot it coming." He grabbed the commander, establishing a direct neural link through his cybernetics. In that instant, the quantum entanglement that Zara had created spread to the commander, forcing him to experience the truth just as they had. But something was wrong. The commander started laughing. You think showing me the truth will change anything? Chrome armor began to melt away, revealing something underneath that made even Vex step back. I've seen the truth already. I am the truth. The figure that emerged was neither human nor alien, but something else entirely. Its form shifted constantly, as if it couldn't decide what dimension it belonged in. A precursor, Zara whispered in shock. But they vanished months ago. We never vanished, the being said, its voice echoing from multiple points in spacetime. We simply waited, watched, and now it's time to reclaim what was ours. The nullifier device began to pulse with ancient power, far beyond anything they had prepared for. The trap had worked perfectly, but they had caught something far more dangerous than they'd expected. As reality began to crack around them, John looked at Zara, then at his parents, then at his cat-turned warrior, and finally at the impossible being that was trying to tear apart everything they had built. So, he said, trying to sound casual despite the universe literally breaking apart around them, anybody got a plan B? The precursor raised its hands, and the final battle for not just the sanctuary, but for Earth itself, was about to begin. The resolution. The precursor's revelation had changed everything. Reality was fracturing around them as the ancient being channeled power through the dimensional nullifier, attempting to reshape Earth's dimension to its original form, a form that had existed before humans, before the Empire, before everything they knew. Your species were never meant to be here. The precursor's voice echoed from multiple points in time simultaneously. Earth was our greatest experiment, our laboratory of reality itself. We will reclaim it. Zara stood her ground, her star-shaper powers creating a shield of pure starlight around their group. This isn't just your world anymore, she said. It's home to billions of beings, both human and alien. John's mother, surprisingly calm despite reality breaking down around her, was rapidly drawing calculations on her tablet. The dimensional stress patterns, she muttered. They're familiar. Mom? John asked, dodging a fragment of crystallized time that shot past his head. This might not be the best time for math. No, she's right, Mrs. Chen said, her fan displaying similar readings. The precursor's power. It's the same basic principle as the dimensional barriers we use to hide the sanctuaries, just on a much larger scale. General Vex's remaining cybernetics were going haywire from the energy overload, but his military mind was still sharp. If we could reverse the polarity of our own barriers, we could create a feedback loop, John's mother finished excitedly, like when you plug a speaker into its own microphone. Mr. Whiskers, who had reintegrated into his full battle form, projected a simulation showing exactly what would happen. The numbers didn't look good. That much dimensional feedback could tear apart the entire solar system, Zara said grimly. Unless. She looked at John, and in that moment, he understood what she was thinking. The quantum entanglement that connected everyone in the sanctuary. It could be used to share not just truth, but power. Everyone, link hands. John called out. Mom, Dad, Mrs. Chen, Vex, everyone. Mr. Whiskers, extend your energy field. As they formed a circle, Zara began to glow with star-shaper energy. But this time, instead of showing them the truth, she was channeling their combined strength, their shared connection to this world they all called home. The precursor laughed, its form shifting through impossible geometries. You think your primitive bonds can stop the architects of reality? Primitive. John's father spoke up for the first time in a while. Let me tell you something about primitive bonds. I've been married to this brilliant woman for 40 years. Every morning, I still fall in love with her a little more. That's not primitive. That's the most advanced thing in any universe. As he spoke, something strange began to happen. The quantum entanglement was responding to pure human emotion, amplifying it through alien technology and star-shaper power. Love, friendship, family. Concepts the precursor had dismissed as primitive were taking on physical form. Zara's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. The star shapers, they weren't just shaping stars. They were shaping connections. The precursor's confident expression faltered as golden lines of energy began connecting everyone in the sanctuary. Humans, aliens, even the mercenaries who had invaded. Each line represented a relationship, a bond, a shared experience that had changed them. "Now, Mom," John shouted. His mother activated her jury-rigged dimensional inverter just as Mrs. Chen's fan sent out a pulse of sanctuary energy. General Vex's remaining cybernetics channeled the power, while Mr. Whiskers amplified it through his quantum-enhanced form. The precursor tried to counter with its nullifier, but found its power being reflected back, amplified by countless bonds of friendship, love, and shared understanding. The very connections it had dismissed as primitive were now its undoing. Reality itself seemed to hold its breath for a moment. Then, the precursor's form began to crystallize, its shifting geometries forced into a single shape by the power of countless relationships anchoring it to this dimension. The nullifier overloaded, but instead of destroying everything, it created something new. When the light faded, the sanctuary had transformed. The dimensional barriers were still there, but they had evolved. Now they didn't just hide. They connected. Every refugee, every person who had ever found shelter here, was linked in a network of light. The precursor, now trapped in a crystalline form, spoke one last time. "Perhaps we were wrong. The experiment yielded results we never imagined." Zara stepped forward, her gown now shimmering with both starlight and the golden energy of connections. "Your experiment created something beautiful. Stay, if you wish. Not as a ruler, but as part of our community." The crystal began to pulse softly, almost like a heartbeat. "I believe," Mrs. Chen said, checking her fan's readings. "That's a yes." As the crisis ended and cleanup began, John found himself sitting with his parents, Zara, Mr. Whiskers, back in house cat form, though his purr now had a slight quantum resonance, and Mrs. Chen in what remained of his apartment's living room. "So," his mother said, sipping her tea as if reality-bending battles were an everyday occurrence, "when's the wedding?" John choked on his coffee. "Mom." "Well, dear, she did sign a contract to stay with you for a year," his mother pointed out. "And technically, according to Section 47B that started all this," Zara, who had been examining the original contract on her holographic tablet, suddenly burst out laughing. "Oh my stars," she said. "Your mother's right. The fine print, it wasn't just an employment contract. In galactic law, I accidentally filed it as a marriage license." Everyone stared at her, then at John, who was turning progressively redder. "You know," Mrs. Chen said thoughtfully, "this would make an excellent story to tell the grandchildren. Once we figure out how human star-shaper genetics work, of course." Mr. Whiskers made a sound that was suspiciously like a laugh. As his family, both human and alien, began excitedly discussing wedding plans, his mother had apparently been designing space-themed centerpieces since the day Zora arrived. John looked around at his impossible new life. His apartment was half destroyed. His cat was a secret agent, his neighbor was an alien refugee coordinator, and his girlfriend was actually an alien princess who had accidentally married him through a paperwork error. And somehow, it all made perfect sense. "Any regrets?" Zara asked softly, taking his hand. Her touch sent little sparkles of starlight dancing across his skin. John smiled, thinking of that day he had signed the contract without reading it properly. The biggest mistake of his life had turned out to be the best decision he never knew he was making. "Just one," he said. "I should have filled out employment forms incorrectly years ago." Above them, through the hole in his ceiling, the stars twinkled a little brighter, as if sharing in the joke, and in its crystal form, the precursor pulsed with a warm light, finally understanding that the most powerful force in any universe isn't the ability to shape reality. It's the connections we shape with each other. The end.